Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going deep, really deep, into a world where, well, sometimes those clickbait headlines we see, they clash with real science. And sadly, it's often vulnerable communities who get caught in the middle of it all.
Yeah, it's a tricky area. I mean, even for those of us who think we know how to spot, you know, the bad stuff.
So true. Okay, so ready to explore let's call it the underbelly of academic publishing.
Let's do it.
All right, so picture this. A headline pops up and it says, big, bold letters, autism can be reversed. Scientists discover, and you think, oh, wow, finally a breakthrough.
Right.
But then what if you find out that study, the one with the amazing headline, was published in a journal, that doesn't have the best reputation, maybe even a journal tied to this thing called, get this, a paper mill.
Oh, yeah. We've got to talk about those.
That's exactly what we're digging into today. It's a story of how let's be honest, a flawed study, a potential paper mill, and, the media, they all kind of came together, created this perfect storm of misinformation, and the autistic community, they're the ones who are really feeling the impact.
And the thing is, this isn't just about, like, one bad study. It's about a whole system, a system that sometimes, let's be honest, cares more about getting lots of studies published than making sure the science is actually, top-notch.
Yeah.
And that can have some pretty big consequences.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start with this whole paper mill thing. Like, what exactly is a paper mill, and how does it connect to the autism study that, we're focusing on today?
Okay, so imagine this. A factory, right? But instead of making, I don't know, widgets or something, it's pumping out research papers. And the people running the factory, they're not so worried about, quality control. Their main goal is just to churn out as many papers as they can, as fast as they can. That's basically been paper mill.
Like a content farm, but for science.
Exactly. And a lot of times, these paper mills, they operate on a pay-to-publish model. So researchers, they pay a fee, and boom, their work gets published, no matter what.
Wait, so the more papers they publish, the more money they make? Doesn't that, totally defeat the purpose of scientific research?
It can, yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely creates some, let's just say it creates some perverse incentives.
For sure. But how does our controversial study fit into all of this?
Well, the journal that published it, it's called MDPI. They run, get this, over 400 journals.
400.
And they rely heavily on these publication fees we talked about. They call them article processing charges. And, running that many journals, making sure the quality is high in every single one, I mean, that's a huge job, right? And then add in this pressure to publish quickly. And, well, you can see how some, let's say, not so great studies might slip through the cracks.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even with the best reviewers, if they're, rushed and under pressure, mistakes are going to happen. But let's be honest, peer review isn't perfect anyway, right? Like, even with the best intentions, things can get missed.
Oh, for sure. Peer review is, it's not a magic bullet. But this study we're talking about, it had some pretty big, let's call them red flags that, honestly, should have been caught. We're talking about a study with just 2 kids, no control group. And get this, the researchers were doing the study on their own kids.
Whoa, hold on. They were experimenting on their own children. That's not a red flag. That's like a whole danger zone. I mean, how did that get through any kind of ethics review? Didn't someone say something like, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea?
Well, the authors, they actually said, get this, they said their study didn't need the usual ethical oversight because it was their own kids. They said they relied on this advisory board from a group called Documenting Hope, instead of an independent institutional review board, an IRB, which is really like the gold standard for protecting people in research.
Documenting Hope. What kind of organization thinks it's okay to skip an independent review for a study like this? Something doesn't sound right.
Yeah, so Documenting Hope, they're really focused on recovery from autism, which already kind of leans into that problematic idea that autism is something that needs to be cured. And the people on these advisory boards, well, a lot of times they're people who already believe in that idea of a cure. So it's not exactly the unbiased, objective oversight you'd want for this kind of study.
So it's like a system designed to confirm what they already believe instead of really looking at the science objectively. No wonder this study got through.
Right.
And then on top of all that, you have this deeply flawed research with, all these ethical issues, and it gets picked up by the media. And what's the headline? Autism can be reversed. Talk about irresponsible.
Yeah, that was the UK Telegraph. They ran with that headline.
Yeah.
Completely ignored, all the problems with the study. And honestly, a headline like that, it's misleading. it could make people think there's a real cure when, there isn't. And that could be really harmful, especially for families who are, looking for answers, looking for help.
It's so sad, yeah. And it's not just about giving people false hope. It also feeds into this idea, this harmful narrative that autism is something that needs to be fixed instead of just, accepting it as part of human diversity. Like being autistic is somehow a bad thing.
That's such a crucial point. This kind of coverage, it makes people think autistic people need to be cured,
Mm.
which can hurt their self-esteem and just reinforces those negative stereotypes. It's like a step backwards for acceptance and understanding.
It's almost like they're saying, hey, you're broken and we need to fix you. That's just wrong. And it's hurtful to the autistic community.
It is. And the thing is, the impact of this bad study and the misleading headlines, it goes way beyond just one article, It spreads on social media, and then you have all this misinformation and harmful stuff floating around, and it's hard to stop.
So it's like one bad apple and the whole barrel gets messed up.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Then it becomes even harder for autistic people to speak up for themselves, to have their voices heard, because there's all this other noise out there.
Wow, this is already a lot to process. And we haven't even gotten to like what can we do to fix this mess, how to make autism research better. Maybe we should take a breather here.
Actually, there's one more thing about this special issue from the Journal of Personalized Medicine. I think we should touch on it before we move on.
Oh, okay. What is it? I'm ready for more.
Let's look closer at some of the other articles that were published, alongside that twin study we talked about. When you read the titles, well, there's a kind of a disturbing pattern that pops up.
What do you mean? Like a common theme or something?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them, they talk about autism as something that needs to be, reversed, cured, that kind of thing. Like one of them is titled Predicting Problematic Behavior in Autism Spectrum Disorder. And there's another one on understanding challenging behaviors in autism spectrum disorder.
So instead of, trying to understand and support autistic people, they're focusing on these behaviors that they consider problematic.
Yep. It's a way of looking at autism, like it's a disease, something bad.
It's like they're only seeing the deficits, the challenges, instead of appreciating the strengths and the different ways of thinking that autistic people bring, right?
You got it. And that kind of thinking, it fuels those cure narratives. It leads to therapies that try to suppress autistic traits instead of just, supporting autistic people for who they are.
Man, it's discouraging to see this kind of thinking in research, especially now when there's so much we could be doing to be more inclusive, more supportive. But hey, maybe this is a good place to pause and come back fresh. We can tackle those solutions in part 2.
Welcome back, everyone. So last time, things got, pretty intense, right? We were talking about that autism study and the whole paper mill thing and how the media, sometimes they don't exactly help the situation,
Yeah, it's there's a lot to unpack there.
For sure. But, I think it's important to talk about these things. So are we ready to, shift gears a bit? Talk about solutions. How can we actually make autism research better, more ethical?
Absolutely, yeah. It's time to move away from this idea of fixing autistic people and really focus on understanding them, supporting them, right? Yes, 100%. Okay, so before we get into those solutions, I'm still kind of stuck on this idea of, those large-scale controlled studies we mentioned before. What makes them so important, especially compared to those anecdotal stories, those case reports we were talking about earlier?
So think of it this way. Imagine someone says, hey, I ate this berry, this special berry, and it cured my allergies. Sounds amazing, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean those berries are like a miracle cure for everyone, right? There could be a million other things going on. And that's why we need those large-scale controlled studies.
So it's about looking beyond just one person's experience and trying to find, patterns in a bigger, more diverse group.
Exactly. So let's say researchers are studying a new therapy, maybe for social anxiety in autistic adults.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just looking at a few people, they'd get hundreds of participants, people with different backgrounds, different needs. And that bigger sample size, it gives you a much better idea of if the therapy actually works.
That makes sense. The more different kinds of people you have in the study, the more confident you can be that, the results will apply to more people. But how do you know that, the results are actually because of the therapy and not just, I don't know, some random thing?
That's where the controlled part comes in. So you take all those participants and you randomly put them into two groups. One group, the treatment group, they get the therapy, and the other group, the control group, they don't. And then you compare the two groups, and that tells you if the therapy is actually making a difference.
Oh, I get it. So the control group is like the baseline, right? It's like a scientific experiment with like safeguards, to make sure the results are real.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
way more reliable than just relying on, single case studies or those anecdotal stories. Those can be honestly misleading, even harmful sometimes.
Yeah. Right, right. It's a totally different world from that twin study we talked about, which didn't have any of those safeguards. Okay, so remember how we talked about involving like autistic people in all parts of the research process? How do we actually do that? I mean, it can't just be like a check mark on a form, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It's got to be a real change in how we think about research.
Yeah.
We have to move away from that, experts know best attitude and start seeing autistic individuals as like partners in research,
Yeah.
not just, subjects.
So researchers should be like actively seeking out autistic people's opinions, collaborating with them throughout the whole research process, right?
Exactly. From the very beginning, designing the study, figuring out the methods, all the way to understanding the results. Autistic voices need to be at the table because they have, unique insights, lived experience that researchers, even the best ones, they might not fully understand.
It's like that saying, nothing about us without us, right? It seems so obvious, but it's surprising how often it's ignored. But involving autistic people, it helps everyone, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And make sure the research is relevant to the autistic community, something that actually matters to them. And it also leads to better, more insightful findings.
Okay, so we've got like good research, ethical research, and we're involving autistic people. What about the media? How can we encourage them to, I don't know, report on autism in a more responsible way?
That's huge. Journalists, they have a big responsibility to go beyond those flashy headlines, the clickbait stuff, and really provide accurate, nuanced information. They got to do their homework, consult with experts, and not try to oversimplify complex research.
So no more autism can be reversed headlines, no matter how many clicks they might get.
Nope, definitely not. And it's not just about avoiding those bad headlines. It's also about showing the diversity within the autistic community, sharing autistic people's stories, challenging those negative stereotypes.
Right. It's about painting a more complete picture of autism, not just focusing on the negatives, but, celebrating the strengths, the unique ways of thinking.
Exactly. The media, they can have a huge impact on how people see autism. They can help create a more inclusive, accepting society.
Okay, I'm feeling a bit more hopeful now. But before we get too carried away, let's recap those 5 guidelines for ethical autism research. The ones we mentioned before. I want to make sure our listener, walks away with those key points.
Good idea. Those are important.
Okay, so number 1, every single study, every piece of research related to autism, it has to go through an independent ethical review. No exceptions.
Absolutely. No more loopholes, no more, those questionable advisory boards.
Number 2, researchers, they can't do studies on their own family members. I mean, come on, that should be obvious, right?
Yeah, agreed. Those kinds of conflicts of interest, they just don't belong in ethical research.
Number 3, we gotta include autistic individuals in every single step of the research process.
Essential. Their voices, their perspectives are so important.
Number 4, focus on those big, well-controlled studies, the ones that can actually give us reliable results that apply to lots of people.
Right, no more relying on those little studies or just anecdotes.
And finally, number 5, the goal of the research, it should be to improve autistic people's lives, their quality of life.
It's time to move past that cure narrative and focus on understanding and supporting autistic people as they are.
Yes, those are great guidelines, like a roadmap for doing research that actually benefits the autistic community. But what about, just everyday people? What can we do, even if we're not scientists or journalists, to, I don't know, to create a better, more supportive environment for autistic people?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's the most important one. It all starts with, learning, educating ourselves. The more we know about autism, the better we can challenge those stereotypes, advocate for inclusion, support autistic people in our communities.
So it's about being like an informed ally, right?
Yeah, read about autism from reliable sources, listen to autistic people. And, when you see those harmful ideas we talked about, those narratives, challenge them. Even small things can make a difference.
I like that. We can all, pay attention to our language, think about our assumptions, and try to create a more welcoming, inclusive space for autistic people.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that diversity is a good thing, that we all benefit from a society that values everyone. celebrates everyone's differences.
Wow, this has been an amazing conversation. We've covered so much from like the dark side of research to, how we can each make a difference. I think it's time to wrap things up and leave our listeners with something to think about.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We've given them a lot to process.
It's been quite a journey, right? But one thing's for sure, we're not done talking about this. So we've really been digging deep, haven't we? Uncovering some pretty concerning stuff about autism research, questionable publishing, the way the media portrays things. But even with all that, I feel like there's got to be hope, right? Like we can do better. We can push for a more, I don't know, a more ethical, a more helpful way of understanding autism.
Definitely. It really comes down to, I think, changing the story, shifting our focus from this idea of fixing autistic people to really trying to understand them, support them, right? Like accepting them for who they are. Because autistic people, they're not broken. They're different. And those differences, we should be celebrating them, not trying to erase them.
I love that. Embracing neurodiversity, right? Recognizing the strengths, the unique perspectives that autistic individuals bring. But let's be real, change, it doesn't happen overnight. There are always going to be people who, I don't know, resist it, hold on to those old views. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, it's definitely a process. But I'm optimistic. We're seeing more and more autistic people, speaking up for themselves, advocating for change. And there are researchers who are committed to doing things the right way ethically. Even some media outlets are trying to change how they talk about autism. Those voices are getting louder and people are starting to listen.
That's good to hear. It really is. It just shows how important it is to speak up, to raise awareness, to have these conversations, because it can lead to real change. But it kind of puts the responsibility on all of us, right? To be informed, to challenge those harmful narratives that we've been talking about.
Exactly. It could be, questioning a headline that seems sensationalized,
Oh,
or supporting an organization led by autistic people, or just, learning more about autism ourselves and helping others to learn too. Every little thing helps.
that's a good point. It's not about waiting for someone else to fix things. It's about, each of us doing what we can right here, right now.
I love that.
Well, this has been, I don't know about you, but this has been a really, really eye-opening conversation for me. We've gone from like uncovering some pretty disturbing stuff to talking about how we can actually make things better. I think it's time to wrap things up, leave our listeners with some, I don't know, some food for thought.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. It's been a lot to take in.
It has. But one thing's for sure, this conversation, it doesn't end here. And to our listeners, I want to leave you with this. How can each of us, in our own way, help to make autism research better, more ethical? It's something to really think about.
It is. And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about autism, about how research should be done, about the media's influence, the better prepared we are to create a world that truly values and celebrates neurodiversity.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Honestly, it's been a really powerful conversation.
It's been a pleasure. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for that better world.
And to our listeners, thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.